Numinous Podcast with Carmen Spaniola.
Hi there, and welcome to the Numinous Podcast, where we have interesting conversations with everyday folks about the mystery of life, broadcasting since 2014. I'm your host, Carmen Spaniola, joining you from the lands of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Songhees and the Esquimalt First Nations, recently known as Victoria, BC, Canada. If you've followed me on Instagram for a while, you know I've been noodling on the subject of moral injury for quite a while. I often put videos about it in my stories, so I know you might miss a lot of them. It could be a little disjointed or hard to follow in a linear way. But I guess in a way that's a nice reflection of life and thought processes, right? Like my thinking hasn't been linear on the topic. I've sort of vacillated a bit in the definition I use. It's kind of evolved over time. The standards that I would apply to discern whether something qualifies as moral injury has also kind of gone back and forth. I tend to think more about how it's often referred to in the research literature, potentially morally injurious events. Anyway, in my literature review over the last 4 years, I've read over 20 significant research papers on moral injury. I've taken a day-long training workshop for mental health professionals, as well as worked my way through completion of the Moral Injury Workbook, which was co-authored by today's guest. And I'm pretty satisfied with the definition I'm using. Moral injury can occur when you do or fail to do something, when you witness something, or when you hear about something after the fact that violates your deeply held beliefs and values in a high-stakes context. So, as longtime listeners would suspect, my take on moral injury is slightly more radical than most experts and researchers because I'm always looking at mental and physical well-being through the lens of class, through the lens of power, privilege, and systems of oppression. So thinking about like who has the power in this situation, who is deemed a legitimate authority to define the terms and definitions and the application of this concept. Who does the prescribed treatment serve? In other words, how does the first-line treatment recommended for this affliction uphold the current status quo in this system of power? Who benefits most from this particular line of treatment, like the client, the service provider, the insurer, the employer, other agents in the system of power? So with moral injury, the salient question for me becomes, who gets to determine whether the stakes are high or how high they are? Like, who determines how deeply held your values are and to what degree they are being violated or how directly impacted you are? So much of the research on moral injury, MI, in the past has come from a military context in an effort to contextualize and support soldiers who felt deeply impacted by things they'd done or things they'd seen in military service. MI is a particular expression of trauma. It's not exactly like post-traumatic stress disorder as we've come to understand that. There's sort of some subtle distinctions. Like with MI, you don't necessarily get jumpy or have flashbacks or nightmares, though insomnia, anxiety, and rumination can all be part of it. Moral injury also involves intense moral emotions like guilt, shame, rage, remorse. So it overlaps with PTSD for sure, but it's not quite the same. And what we've come to realize is it's maybe not best treated as PTSD and with the same course of care. Now, I understand why researchers want to keep definitions tight and clear and like fairly narrow, because in order for a diagnosis to have utility, like in order for it to guide us towards the best treatment, it's important that we maintain parameters and that like words mean specific things. And yet, in the age of the internet, where information, at least to some extent, is more democratized, people are more and more able to decide for themselves who gets to determine definitions and application. It's people who get to discern who's included in this phenomena, whose experience is going to be centered in the treatment. So more and more, it's the barefoot doctors that we celebrate so much, right? The barefoot doctors on the front lines of trauma. In other words, the lay counselors, the mental health first aid attenders, the caregivers, the doulas of life and death and mental health in communities. They recognize a useful framework and then apply it to grassroots work. And this is what I start to see happening with moral injury. In the past couple of years, since the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, the global COVID pandemic, which came down so hard on healthcare workers, we now see the moral injury lens applied more broadly to occupational health research, and especially to include those workers who had to make tough decisions with limited resources and capacities about who was going to live and who was going to die. We now are seeing MI applied to workplaces, which I think maybe is an indicator that we're in our whistleblower era. Like, people see the appalling corruption of the capitalist system, how it abuses people and the planet, and people with firsthand information can't withstand the burden of silence anymore. But we have to support these people with more than just class solidarity. Class solidarity isn't enough. We have to develop ways to offer mental and emotional support to people who decide they can't participate in these systems anymore. And of course, now after so many months of the most heinous, just barbarous crimes against humanity enacted by the state of Israel against the Palestinian people, untold millions of us are caught in this kind of semantic or conceptual limbo where we are not quite directly impacted enough. We don't have feet on the ground. We're not clearly as impacted as the people in Gaza or the people working in Gaza. Yet, we can suffer many similar symptoms, many of the same symptoms of moral injury, like grief and despair, guilt and shame, anger and moral outrage, sustained and intense preoccupation, social withdrawal and isolation from friends and family who just don't understand, the loss of faith in humanity or a just world. And maybe there's something about unmediated access to these images, these sounds, these stories that, science and research just have not caught up to. But anyway, here we are. We've got to work with what we've got. And essentially what we've got is tons of data on how moral injury has been treated and cared for, I guess you could say, but the treatment for it in the military, healthcare, and other occupational settings. And there is good data here and decades of experience. And that's why I'm so honored today to welcome to the show one of the foremost experts on moral injury, Robyn Walser. Okay, actually, content note for this episode. We should put this in here. We're discussing moral injury, right? Which means that there are going to be some examples stated that are of just the most heartbreaking kinds, right? Like infant death, causing accidental death. We're not going to talk in super deep detail, but there are mentions. So if you find yourself not breathing, bring on your arms and legs, have a little stretch, stand up, literally stand up. That's the first somatic exercise to get out of freeze, is to literally stand up. Walk around a little bit, even if it's just in a little circle, walking forward, looking forward. Busy yourself for a few minutes, make dinner, fold laundry, pull weeds, distract yourself for a minute. These mentions will pass quickly, but do be aware and track yourself. Be gentle, be tender, be soft, yet mobilized enough, right? In touch with your surroundings enough to not get stuck or to not sort of drift off into unplanned and unwelcome dissociation. If it's a nice welcome break, feel free, drift off. But if it's going to impair you, then just fast forward the track for a minute or two. Okay, back to our guest. Dr. Robyn Walser is a licensed psychologist and author of 7 books on acceptance and commitment therapy, commonly known as ACT. She has most recently written a book called The Heart of ACT, Developing a Flexible, Process-Based, and Client-Centered Practice Using Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. She's an assistant professor at the University of California, Berkeley, the director of TL Psychological and Consultation Services, and works at the National Center for PTSD. Dr. Walser has been offering ACT workshops since 1998. Let's learn more about moral injury as we welcome to the show Dr. Robyn Walser. So, Robyn, what identities do you lead with?
Probably sister first, because I really play such a big role in my family and sort of orient us after the passing of my mother. Then psychologist and friend. I suppose things like my sexual identity sort of fall down much lower down the hierarchy because I'm a little older now, and these things just kind of, I don't know, maybe when we get older, those things just don't, you're just sort of both, right? Or all, or something like that. And so I think probably sister, psychologist, and friend are the top one.
Thank you. I am delighted. I'm really honored to be speaking with you today about moral injury. Why don't we start first things first, just a basic definition. What definition do you like to use for moral injury?
Well, there's some, a couple in the literature, and some has to do with being betrayed in some really important way, that you were maybe trusting leadership and they betrayed you. And we see these kind of definitions come out of military experiences. And then it got expanded into engaging in behaviors that you disagree with, that you find morally wrong, but you did those behaviors. And then you experience the fallout of like guilt, shame, pain, anger. There's a group of us that have been working on moral injury for quite a while, and I'll put some shout outs to Jacob Farnsworth, Lauren Borges, Kent Drescher, who's probably been the one who's been working on it the longest, and Sean Barnes. We think of it as not the pain itself. So there's the violation. You violated your morals. I'll give an example of what that could be here in just a minute. And then you feel pain as a result of that, whatever that pain is, guilt, shame, etc. And we would say the injury is then you try to suppress, fight with, struggle, try to get rid of, hide, run from, eliminate that pain. And so a lot of other definitions sort of hang out in, it ends with, you did this thing and you feel pain. We say you did this thing, you feel pain. That's a natural response to a moral injury. It's that you can't have that response where the problem really surfaces and arises for people. And a good example might be, we saw some of this during COVID, when we were in the height of COVID, where healthcare providers were having to make really awful decisions, like who gets oxygen and who doesn't. And, you're having to make some decisions about who's going to get that medication or this medication. And you want to do it for everybody, but you're overwhelmed by the numbers. You don't have the equipment, you don't have the people, you don't have the space. And so you end up making some choices about, who gets to be on the ventilator or not, which could go against your personal experience of, I want to help, I'm here to serve all, I'm taking an oath, right? Some other examples might be things like, I was texting while driving and I caused an accident where somebody passed away. I found myself, knowing that I could recycle, and there's different variations and levels, of course, that I'm talking about, because the climate change is really problematic, and I'm not participating in any way. So you can sort of just imagine moral violations where you have pain, and then you really try to eliminate, get rid of, and struggle with that pain.
Is it still moral injury if it's something that we are witnessing that we're powerless to stop? Like, let's say we know someone is lying. Let's say their ex, we know our ex is abusive or lying, but in order to protect the children, we don't tell people, we don't reveal that this person is they behave in a duplicitous way or something like that. And so even if it wasn't an error of commission, but it's a sense of powerlessness or omission that we can't stop a thing that we're seeing, would we still call that morally injurious?
It could be, depending. So if I know somebody's lying about something and I don't reveal it, I just keep quiet about it, like it's a omission, right? That might be like a morally, maybe a bit reprehensible if I don't like it, or I might feel guilty for a little bit of time. But typically when you're thinking about moral injury, as described in the literature, it's high stakes. So somebody's life is in danger. Somebody's integrity is in danger. So you want to think high stakes in terms of moral injury. Otherwise, it's more like a moral violation or something that is distasteful, morally distasteful. So it takes on different flavors, and you might kind of think of it on a continuum, but the injury is in the high stakes situation.
Okay.
Did you save somebody's life or not? And it can be witnessing,
Right.
and it can be omission. So high stakes situation where you don't do anything, or you never say anything about what you saw or what happened in ways that could actually be change the outcome of something.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
does that
what
make sense?
about this? Yeah, what about the scale? We're witnessing multiple genocides on our phone. We individually can't do anything about that, but we experience shame at our governments, or we experience powerlessness, utter powerlessness, or we're not out there front lines protesting for racial justice. Climate change is occurring. We've done all the things and it's not working. And now we need a break, so we're flying to Hawaii or something like that. Like, what about these very large scale cooperation dilemmas at which we actually couldn't, as an individual, enact that much change? We can't like pull the lever, but we feel responsible because we are collectively experiencing impacts, but it's the distribution of that is so disparate. Some people are suffering more than others. Does moral injury still come under that umbrella?
I would probably put it lower on the kind of continuum, but not at the bottom, right? It's not like, somebody told a fib and I kept it quiet. But you're also not like there. Like if I were to think of an example of a moral injury, let's say if you're participating in trying to help people in Gaza, let's say, and you're in the situation, maybe you're somebody who's providing food and people keep coming to you and you can't deliver the food, and you know that they're on their last bit of food, right? Like you could begin to encounter a sense of betrayal from your government, and also a sense of powerlessness in being able to help in the way that you want to help. So then I'd say, yep, moral injury can happen there. Witnessing it on your phone sort of tilts it down a little bit because you're not directly exposed to the situation like I just described. I do want to say this though. because I want to be very thoughtful about how we think about this process, is that moral emotions are social emotions. So things like shame and guilt are tucked inside of social experiences, like a relationship between you and I. And that we, as a typically or generally cooperative group, we would hope, right, is that those emotions function to help keep us more cooperative. So if I'm engaging in behaviors that are damaging to the group and I get shame or guilt as a result of that, that's functional, that's important, that's informational. Why would we want to eliminate that? Right? Like if I did something that was harmful and I say, I feel guilt and shame over this, I don't want to do it anymore. That's useful to the group as a whole. But if I have no shame, I have no guilt, and I'm engaging in behaviors that are damaging, now we've got a real problem. We've lost the social function of them, of those emotions. And you can see some pretty awful things come out of that kind of behavior where you do stuff just because you can.
Mm-hmm.
So then I want to move it into a place of what can the social group do? And you see it happening on campuses right now with Gaza. Like the group as a whole is witnessing a socially, morally bad thing. And so there's people cooperating and coming together. Do they each individually have moral injury? No, I wouldn't say that. But do they have a moral obligation and they're cooperating on that? Then I would say, yeah, we're right in the right spot.
Mm-hmm. So there's kind of this spectrum. Let's kind of bring it then from just for a moment, contextualize that there's this next little place then around vicarious trauma, secondary trauma, and the burnout that can come, and even guilt around feeling burnt out as an activist or as, somebody who is engaged. You know, elections happen every 4 years. I think many people are still exhausted from the last one and may, may have more ambivalence than before and maybe some guilt about that. What are some of the links between burnout and secondary trauma and this kind of moral quality to it? Because, when it's like relentlessly attacking your values, at some point it may not be moral injury, but there's still impact.
Yeah. Well, so when you think about what's happening inside of things like burnout and probably more like vicarious traumatization, right? The sort of quality of these bad things keep happening and I'm sort of soaking it in and taking it in and I'm being worn down and worn out by it. Compassion fatigue might be another way to think about it, is that you end up landing in a place where you feel like nothing you do matters. So why bother? And things become more mechanical, you disinvest, you you kind of don't care about the outcome anymore because it doesn't matter anyway. Those that are in power are going to win and always will win. And I'm ineffective, essentially. So the problem with that in that burnout place is that then you might do things like not vote because it doesn't matter anyway. My self-efficacy is gone. Or that it's sort of pointless and purposeless in those places. And I think then what happens is we lose those folks who might really be making a difference in some way. And why the prevention of burnout, I think, is so important, just so that you sort of stay connected to that moral compass. I just had an example of this a little bit earlier where someone was talking about how they made a decision that impacted someone who they care about in a really negative way. And it's because they're just sort of walking through the day, like just ticking boxes and just walking through the day, just trying to get it over with and, go sit on the couch and be disconnected from it all in that kind of burnout place. And what happened is that this other person really was suffering as a result of this sort of uncaring response. Not so easy to just say what you need to do is like prevent burnout. Sometimes people are so invested and they care about it so much and they get in there. Is that we need to recognize what happens in burnout and vicarious traumatization and see that there's people get so depleted that they need the replenishment so that they can re-engage and come back to this place where caring matters, and recognize that maybe they're not, like, we don't want to blame them. Does that make sense? And now look what you did, you back, because that just heaps on the shame. It's like kicking somebody when they're down. Instead, what do we need to do to care for you so that you can come back into a place where your caring is now functioning again? And I think that, it isn't about eliminating emotions or anything like that. It's like showing up to them and being present to what's there and what's being experienced by the individual.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. They say cynicism is a thwarted fight response. So it makes so much sense to me, that we can just be like, what is the point? But it's that inability to mobilize or to feel that your mobilization is so futile and you're not moving the needle and you're not having impact. Yeah, it makes so much sense to me that we need to approach that from a different perspective so people don't just like pile on themselves even more. You specialize in acceptance and commitment therapy. And, a lot of the kind of recent research that I've seen and like a bit of a literature review around first line treatments for moral injury are kind of in the cognitive behavioral umbrella. But a lot of experts critique that because, moral injury isn't an error in thinking, right? And so sometimes that approach can really undermine or invalidate these moral and social emotions as you're describing it. So can you explain to us what acceptance and commitment therapy ACT, what is that approach and how is it a little bit different from CBT, and how do you bring in the heart of that, of acceptance and commitment therapy to support moral injury?
Yeah, great question. So it might take me just a moment here to organize and get myself thinking about this. So I'll just start with moral injury and then lead into ACT and this distinction between ACT and sort of the broad umbrella of other sort of cognitive interventions that are focused on changing the way you think, so to speak. Not that changing the way you think doesn't occur in ACT, but it's an additive versus a subtractive process. So if I've done something where I violated my moral values in a high stakes situation, let's say that, let's pick a birth example. I give birth to twins. This is not me, but this is an example that I'm aware. I give birth to twins, and one of them, by no fault of my own, was deprived of oxygen during the passage through the birth canal, and now is basically nearly brain dead and is only going to live in a vegetative state for the rest of its life. And somebody whispers to me, you don't have to feed that baby. And so essentially, like, let's say I make a choice where I'm going to withhold feeding from the baby so this baby doesn't have a life of just being on ventilators and in a vegetative state. Can you feel the high stakes?
Oh my gosh, yeah, I'm just going to invite everyone to feel their seat and their feet, and like I have a little saltiness in my nose and behind my eyes. Like I'm sure somebody has literally had this happen, and yeah, what a terrible thought or decision or burden to even think about this. Yeah.
Well, and probably happens more than people realize, right? Like there's decisions like this being made by people who love these babies, right? And so if you made that decision, you can just feel the burden that could unfold with you for the rest of your life, right? That sort of space of, what did I do? This is not what I want to be about, morally speaking or values-based speaking. But you can also sort of see the other side of it in some ways, right? Like the complicated values-based thing. And let's say I start having thoughts that are like, I'm horrible, I'm a monster, what's wrong with me? How could I have done something like that? And I really seek into a sense of shame and guilt about what happened. And you would be understandable. You could see how that would unfold. And so if you take an ACT model and bring it into helping somebody who's struggling in that space, we would look at the kinds of thoughts that you're having and help you gain perspective on them so that you can see thinking and make sense of why you might say those kinds of things to yourself. Like you probably a long time ago learned that people who do bad things are monsters, so you then equated it and applied it to yourself. It's not that you wanted to have those thoughts, right? Like you learn them and then they show up in situations that make sense. They get triggered in situations that they make sense. So you're struggling with it. And what we want to do is help build a place where you can observe those thoughts and not get too entangled in them so that they then like seem to push you into behaviors where, along with the shame and guilt, are sort of pushing you around in your life. And so you get small and you start violating more values that you have because you're avoiding the experience as much as possible. And what we would want to do is come in and say, those thoughts make sense. And let's see if we can change your relationship with them so they're not like seeming to push you around anymore, get you back in line with your values and what you care about. And notice that these emotions are actually telling you something. Like imagine you made that same choice and you had no guilt and shame. Like, can you sort of like see how powerful that those emotions and shame, they tell you you're human. They tell you that if the choice was hard and you didn't want to do it, right? Like I almost am in this place. Thank goodness that you experience guilt and shame. Like I almost feel like monster would be on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense when I say it?
Totally.
That it would be on the other side of this if you didn't have guilt and shame. So we want to open up to the experience of guilt and shame and from an ACT position and let it inform you rather than force you.
Mm-hmm.
Guilt and shame can often make you hide and withdraw. And what we want it to do is be informative. I want to live this way, not that way. And how can I honor the child that was lost? You see, like we sort of want to transform it in some ways. And a typical CBT model, big C, and what I mean by that is almost strictly cognitive in terms of theory, would say that I'm having the thought that I'm a monster is dysfunctional and irrational. And our model doesn't hold that thinking isn't dysfunctional. It's just been learned. It isn't irrational. These kinds of things are not logical. So I'm not going to try to move somebody from illogical, irrational to logical. That's not what this is about. Like these are felt experiences and they have a lot of powerful emotion in them. It's beyond just the logic that you can make from them. So we don't want to now burden somebody with, and your thinking is broken too. And often that, changing the thinking can have the quality of, let's lower the temperature on the shame and the guilt. And I asked, well, would we want to do that in these circumstances? Like, would they be less informative in that sense? I don't want people to be consumed with shame and guilt either, right? And so that's what the disentanglement from the words are about, and opening up to the flow of emotional experience rather than I need to eliminate those emotional experiences. So the distinction is in what the goal is. It's to act is to be open and aware, and more cognitive-based therapies tend to be in line with eliminate symptoms and get rid of the experiences, the internal experiences. Does that answer the question that you asked?
For sure. And there is the commitment aspect of ACT we can think of as being that reconnection or reorientation where we reach towards what we really care about and we like re-embed ourselves in our morals. And so can you talk a little bit about what we know now with more recent research around how we would treat moral injury? These are social emotions, and so it seems necessarily part of the solution or the remedy for the suffering is going to be a social solution. Now we see that they recommend like spiritual care, pastoral care, community connection, coming out of that isolation and the sort of collapse freeze response, bottom up approaches that are mindfulness or somatics, etc. So can you orient us to, especially for folks who are suffering with this right now, like what would be, a sunbeam through the clouds for them, Robyn? What would they orient to as hope for a different way of being in relationship with this painful reality that we just need to accept has happened or you did?
Yeah. Well, so you can feel how guilt and shame might start to constrict somebody's life and isolate them. Because the first thing that happens if I say to you, Carmen, tell me your most shameful event, just go ahead, put it out there, right? Like can you feel the withdrawal,
Yeah.
pull
Yeah.
back? And so if you have very heavy guilt and shame, like about some of these high stakes situations that we're talking about, you can get very careful and pulled in, and you stop doing things that you care about, and little tiny violations in your values begin to happen. And then if it grows across time, like you can see people who just completely isolate and withdraw around the shame. And then you can just feel it folding in on itself, right? So when I think about how to move out of this space, it is, I'm going to hold this guilt and shame and let it flow. It'll rise and fall if you get present to it. It'll come and go. You'll be reminded of it and not. And I'm going to reorient to the morals and the values that got violated in the first place. What matters to me here? What do I care about? What kind of meaning do I want to create as I step forward in my life? And then I start re-engaging in actions that are about that. So you commit with your feet to live those values again. So let's take a healthcare worker, let's say, who got burned out, had to make a choice between, giving somebody a medication that would be life-saving and not. And they start really sinking into the moral violation. They go on sick leave. They're at home just taking, kind of boiling around inside of this thing that happened. And people will do things like, I deserve to suffer. I deserve this pain. But when we're suffering in pain, the other thing that happens socially is we either disconnect from those who or others around us begin to suffer too. Those who care about us begin to suffer. So it just has these social tendrils that reach out. And so what if you can reorient to your values, hold that pain, and come back to, I care about this thing, and I'm going to stay engaged with it in honoring that even honoring the values in the first place, but honoring this value that got violated. I'm going to come back to it, and I'm going to do something here that gets me reconnected to my social experience. And we as social beings can assist in that process. And so when you think about treatment, I think it's a really great idea to do it with others. So you could do it in individual psychotherapy, let's say, but doing it in group psychotherapy where other people are experiencing moral injury might really be that more healing space, because you can share in the pain of this thing that happened. You can connect with the values that were violated and see them as a social process. You can explore together what it means to see what you learned and the messages you got, and how you might transform your own behavior such that you're re-engaging. Let's say, for instance, just another example, you harmed a child, but you have children yourself. And then you disengage from them because I don't want to harm them too. I'm a monster kind of comes back in, right? And so now you've lost the social connection with your own children. And so re-engaging your values would be about committing to come back to them and re-engaging with them as if the moral violation had never happened. It's a kind of forgiveness and give what went before this thing happened. I'm going to step back into a place where I'm reconnecting to what my own personal meaning and what I care about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, Robyn, you're exposed to a lot of suffering, and you are witnessing others processing these morally injurious events and circumstances. How do you personally cope with the grief and the rage and despair?
Well, I use a lot of ACT on myself. Like, I open up to that experience. I recognize the social process that's there, and I actually have an appreciation, oddly enough, for the guilt and shame. And people might be like, what? But it's like, I have an appreciation for it, because if you can let that inform you, it means you probably come back and be in a more cooperative social space. So I can recognize an appreciation. And I just try to remind myself how human we all are. And we think we know what we do in some circumstances, but when you get yourself inside of those circumstances, maybe you don't really know what you would do. And to try to have a little bit more openness to the struggles that we have as human beings. I'm sort of reminding myself of human nature, and how we have to work at keeping our social and cooperative space connected and loving and belonging. And then I also have a glass of wine from time to time.
With no guilt, no shame.
I need a glass of wine.
Yeah, understandable.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your experience, and creating spaces to open up this conversation that so many suffer with in silence and isolation. This feels really important. I'm really grateful on behalf of all the listeners who got this, and we'll put in the show notes all the ways they can continue learning from you in the future. Thanks for your time today, Robyn.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And folks may want to read the Moral Injury book. It's a self-help book if they're really struggling and want to go through and read that. There's some really good folks who put that together, and I think it's got some great words of wisdom in it around this particular issue.
Yes. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you for inviting me.
What an honor to have an expert like Robyn on the show. I want to thank Robyn again for bringing her clarity, as well as her warmth, her empathy, and also her pro-social stance to this interview. I know her audience is very often just a different milieu, but I appreciate her tailoring the approach for Numinous Podcast listeners. If you're a practitioner seeking supervision for this topic, you will want to check out Robyn's website for sure, which I'll link to in the show notes, and definitely you'll want to pick up some of her books. I've read at least 4 of them and enjoyed them. I actually think several are good for lay people as well, like just as a way to grapple with wrongs you can't make right. Like I use the ACT approach to a certain extent anyway in my Collapse 101 course, and just like my manner of approach when it comes to thinking about and living meaningfully in late stage racialized capitalism. So I highly recommend Robyn's heart-centered approach to acceptance and commitment therapy. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, I did take a couple months to work through the moral injury workbook. It is very good. My only qualm is that it opens with a military case study that, against the backdrop of the genocide in Gaza, I just didn't tolerate very well. We have an abolitionist stance here on the podcast, so we don't talk to cops. The military is a tool to protect like the elite class of resource hoarders. Like that's just like that's not a debate we're going to have. Like if anything, we probably need more in the DSM about hoarding wealth and annihilating one's home planet, and like obviously sociopathy and psychopathy fit well there, but where do we place the folks who are willing to carry out the agenda of the ruling class? Not the people who are signing up for the military because they want a college education, all the minorities that get recruited, but, particularly the, what they call it, like the administrative class in the military. Anyway, this is why the DSM isn't worth the paper it's written on. These are not clean categories. This would be a much more useful book if it was just trees. Anyway, okay, I'm drifting off topic here, but anyone who knows me knows that we're abolitionists. We don't necessarily endorse the DSM-5, that's for sure. So I have used the moral injury workbook as reference material for the moral injury course that I'm offering in the Numinous Network in June 2024. So if you want to work through your experience of potentially morally injurious events and experiences, and a sympathetic portrait of a soldier's plight is not your jam right now, then I invite you to join us in the Numinous Network. I think this course would benefit the people who do feel greatly impacted by witnessing genocide on your phone. I think it would also help anyone who is living with the remorse and pain of accidentally causing death or injury. And certainly professionals, the daily ethical dilemmas faced by mental health professionals working in carceral healthcare systems, that definitely applies here. If you are someone who is bystanding in the workplace, with bullying or racism, for fear of dismissal or reprisal or becoming a target. If you are a whistleblower or a conscientious objector, it could be good. If you're bystanding and deciding whether to intervene in suspected intimate partner abuse, but you're in your own freeze response, trauma response, that could be good. If you have survived the indignity of sexual assault, of racism or a hate crime, that definitely applies. If you're navigating community response after leaving a narcissistic partner who is, giving one face to the public, grooming, your community as much as they groomed you, that can be very confusing and difficult. Those kinds of responses could potentially be morally injurious. Anyway, there's all these different things that I think would be helpful, even if you don't technically have a case of moral injury. These are all the things that you would do anyway for trauma recovery. That's what we're going to be doing in the network. Anyway, some of the signs you might be suffering from moral injury could include just someone did you dirty and you can't let it go, or you failed to act and it's gnawing at you years later, which I will confess this was totally the case with me. I intended to use the moral injury workbook to work on witnessing genocide, but actually what happened was memories of an instance where I failed to protect an Indigenous woman from harm in a white dominant group, of which I was a co-leader, that instance just like kept coming back to me, flooding me. And I needed to do like quite a bit of work outside the workbook. Like I needed my own therapist, my own supervision, a liberatory coach, like multiple points of access to support to get to a place where I could move through the remorse and the shame towards offering apology and making space in my life to be available for repair, So not everybody's going to have that case, but like there's only so much a workbook can do, right? I do love the workbook, but okay, let me just go on to other signs. Other signs could be like, so you're mentally looping on a wrong you can't make right. Self-regulation isn't working with this particular problem. Like you're trying, but it's just like eating you up inside. It's not getting better. You might also be like dissociating, ruminating, fantasizing. You could be self-harming or doom scrolling, all different kinds of ways where the freeze state is sort of taking you off track in your life for extended periods of time. You feel intense moral emotions like anger, shame, disgust, empathy, or guilt. And here's what I actually think is like almost the signature of moral injury. It's hard to talk about, like the worst parts especially. It's hard to talk about even with a trusted therapist. So in the moral injury course, we're going to focus on integrating both a top-down and a bottom-up approach. So top-down being like cognitive integration. So we aren't just going to do like CBT, right? An ACT. We'll do a little bit of that, but we're also going to do somatics, attachment, polyvagal theory, contact nutrition, all the usual stuff we do in the network for trauma recovery. But also importantly, we have a social component in the sense of doing personal individual work, but in a collective container, collective context. So it's not open circle where everyone's just going to talk about their trauma. That's totally not what we're going to do. However, like the more progressive contemporary therapeutic approach recommended by researchers for moral injury is more of a spiritual counseling kind of approach, because MI is a social wound that requires social healing. So we need reconnection to our values in order to move forward and like live more meaningfully, but also to return to more secure relating to others. So we need to normalize and humanize our experience in the context of a like-minded community. So you don't all have to be grappling with the same moral injury. You don't all have to be soldiers or healthcare workers. It's just that you need to be grappling with similar dilemmas, moral emotions. So that like-minded community grappling is really necessary. And also, recent research on neurodivergence helps us understand that for many people, especially anyone attempting to like face something that feels overwhelming or confusing, many people benefit from body doubling, literally just all doing something at the same time. So like all taking a program at the same time. This is why like in high school, you would all go to the library and study quietly, but together. Because body doubling has a measurable benefit over solo work, with just like yourself in your journal or yourself in a workbook. And that's because it can calm the brain, because we're outsourcing a lot of our executive functioning to the pre-planned and like pre-administered structure. And so when our brain is calmer, it's easier to scan for safeness, to move beyond scanning for threat, to be able to scan for safeness. And when we can land a little bit of safeness, our brains can actually comprehend and integrate information better. We can actually learn. Again, it's not that a workbook isn't useful. It definitely is. And like many neurotypes and certain attachment styles will definitely prefer it. But just know that the way that we do the group work components in the Numinous Network is somewhat unique, because we emphasize agency, like choice, and pacing, and a neuro-affirming environment. So because we emphasize that neuroaffirming environment, we create spaces that are a bit easier for people with sensitive nervous systems to be in. Like, that's our jam, is supporting people with sensitive nervous systems. Everybody in the Numinous Network has a sensitive nervous system. Many are neurodivergent. So because we understand that, we encourage like a little bit of a stretch towards neuroplastic events. In other words, we like encourage a wee bit of a stretch for growth, but we're always trying to avoid prediction errors. It's like we want you to know, here's what's going to happen, here's what to expect, because we don't want people to stretch so much that they feel the need to employ morphic adaptation, also known as masking. You shouldn't have to mask to participate. So our motto is never push through signs of distress. And within our culture, we would consider distress to be like, just like you don't want to do something. So that's like distress enough. So pause the practice, opt out of that. When we do sort of say, okay, we're going to go into some like contact nutrition, we're going to go into like more ventral vagal social engagement nervous system stuff, we use a highly choreographed structure like for our breakouts, so everyone knows exactly what to expect, no prediction errors, with a genuine emphasis on less is more, slower is better, small is all. That's our manner of approach. So our small group work and breakouts, that amounts to like no more than like 15 to 17 minutes total time in participatory engagement with like one or two other people. And there's very clear turn-taking signals and time limits. So people on the spectrum and people with like pretty severely insecure attachment styles often find the breakouts quite a relief, because you're not just like left to flail in an awkward social free fall, like totally dependent on whatever the dominant nervous system does, so that means you use less energy, like fewer spoons on striving to perform neurotypically. We don't want people performing. So of course, the social components of the moral injury course are totally not compulsory. But again, many neurodivergent folks appreciate the way we do them because they can participate more easily than most group spaces. Of course, if you still would prefer to do the work solo, that's also fine. We have a genuine option for that. You can just watch the recordings. And it's the same if you can't make the live session times for the MI course. You can just watch the recordings. They'll be posted the same day as each session, and they'll be permanently archived, so there's no FOMO, no urgency, no pressure. And, if now isn't a great time to do the program, it will always be there for you to do in a self-paced way later on this year, whenever. So for details around specific dates and times, see the show notes in your podcast player. Or if your podcast player doesn't allow that much space, if it cuts it off, you can just go to numinouspodcast.com to find this episode. There's also a complete calendar of events under the Numinous Network tab on my website. You'll just scroll down a bit where you see live sessions, that area, and then you'll find a button that says View the Live Sessions. And just know that no matter which price point you choose for your membership, you'll have access to all the live events on the calendar, in addition to all the on-demand video classes. There's like no different access for your price. It's just a pay what you can price. Okay, shifting to listener shout out. It's actually a book review shout out today. This is from Sarah, who's an avid reviewer on Goodreads, by the way. I think anyone who reviews stuff and puts it on the internet is so generous. And Sarah has reviewed almost like 300 books. It's amazing. We trust her. She's taking this seriously. So Sarah gave my book, The Spirited Kitchen, 5 stars and writes, "The witchy book I always wanted. Recipes, small spells, all the crafts, super informative notes. I borrowed it from Kate, but I'm sure as heck gonna buy my own." Thank you for taking the time to write a nice review, Sarah. And thanks, Kate, for loaning her my book. The Spirited Kitchen, Recipes and Rituals for the Wheel of the Year is also available at many libraries. So if yours doesn't have it, just ask them to bring it in for you. And my next book is coming out in January 2025. It's called Spells for the Apocalypse, Practical Magic for Turbulent Times. It's published by Countryman Press, an imprint of W.W. Norton. Pre-orders will begin at Halloween. I'll open them up at my annual Samhain event, which is New Year. You can also leave me a voice note or written feedback on this episode at castfeedback.com/Numinous Podcast. That's castfeedback.com/Numinous Podcast. The Numinous Podcast is a proud supporter of the People's Public Health Education Campaign. What's the difference between a surgical mask and a respirator, you wonder? Let's ask the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety. They say that surgical masks, those like little flimsy surgical masks, the ones that like go over the ears, you sometimes still see them given out at like doctors' offices and shops. So they say surgical masks provide fluid barrier protection, literally like from the sprayed droplets and germs from sneezing and coughing by the wearer. So it protects other people from the sneezes and coughs of the person wearing it, but just the fluids. Respirators, on the other hand, are designed to help protect the wearer from exposure to airborne contaminants such as particles, gases, and vapors. SARS-CoV-2, COVID, is an airborne contaminant. So respirators have a tight fit and are marked with their approval rating, like N95 or N99. So we call them all masks, but really what we're talking about, what we ought to be wearing, are the respirators, tight fit, marked with their approval rating of N95 or N99 if we're starting to track H5N1. It's nonstop practical information right up to the last minute on the show, my friends. It's wall to wall. So wear your respirator, your N95 or N99 mask indoors and in crowds to protect yourself from asymptomatic carriers and from folks who think they just have a cold. Thanks for listening, my friends. To join us for the Moral Injury course, simply sign up for the Numinous Network. It's included with membership, and yes, that's the only way to take the course. I also highly recommend you join us a little early, like join now, because we can begin laying a somatic foundation for the work. You could attend some embodied attachment, some like therapeutic tremoring sessions, maybe self-massage and somatics, just maybe even get started with the SSP, the Safe and Sound Protocol. There's just lots of ways to support your psycho-emotional and somatic capacity for this healing work. Live sessions of the Moral Injury course begin on June 28th. Find out more about the Numinous Network and sign up for my newsletter so you get reminders of these things at carmenspagnola.com. CarmenSpagnola. Until next time, take care.